Thanks, Drew. I love coming to this church, for real. Always, whenever I can come to speak on your series, it's just always a pleasure to me. I mean that. You've got a great spirit about you, and I love the long-time relationship that our congregation at Hoover has had with Asheville Road, and so many of our members know each other, and it's always good for me to come here, and I just look forward to it. And glad Melanie could come with me tonight. And she enjoys being here as well. I hope you guys are doing well. I shared Drew's concern. I was getting some texts this afternoon from some of our members asking, "Are we meeting tonight? You know, what's going on with the weather?" And it turns out, as Drew said, things haven't gotten bad yet. I don't know if they are or not, but anyway, I'm glad we're here. You know, I finished teaching this class at Hoover a few months ago. I actually started it. It's funny. I started it in 1st of March of 2020. I think I did 2 classes before the world fell apart, you know. And I was really excited about this class that I was going to be teaching because I felt like it was needed. And it was one of these, it's a little bit different from the kind of class a lot of times I teach. It wasn't a text-based class, but it was one that was kind of an analysis of culture, like some things going on in the world. And specifically, it was looking at some changes in generational sorts of things. There are some pretty drastic, pretty significant changes in generations. This has always been true, you know. I don't want to act like, it's truer now than it has been in the past. Some people would suggest to you, because of the, availability of technology and the way that the world has changed technologically in the last 20 years, it has increased the rapidity with which these changes occur. So some of the stuff going on with like Gen Z, those born like 1997 and after or whatever, and then the millennials born before that, some of the changes in the way they view reality and the way that we view truth and the way that we process information about religion and all that has created a kind of interesting dynamic in American culture. And you've seen some of the studies that have come out in recent years. And I say all this because, I started that class back in 20. I did 2 weeks. And then after things kind of got back to normal a little bit, I finished that class just a few months ago. And so I've been thinking about this a lot because I think it's something that is of concern to the church. We feel like we are losing power in our culture. We feel like we're losing cultural power, like we don't even have a seat at the table anymore. We feel like maybe we used to have more influence on the political stage, and we don't have a whole lot of influence there anymore, we feel like. And we feel like that there's this rise in secularism, and there is, especially if you look at a graph of ages, you start with the young and you go to the old, and then you put on that same graph outward exercise of religion, then it'll be high among those who are older, and it'll be low among those who are younger. There's this correlation. And so there is an increase in secularism. There is a decrease in religiosity in America. And so I think there's been some hand-wringing among us. And we ministers, your elders, I'm sure, talk about this sort of thing. In churches, we wring our hands a little bit over this. We get nervous about it. We see changes that are happening in the way people define sexuality, the way they define gender, what is accepted, what is not accepted. And we worry. We worry about what the church is going to do, what the world is going to look like when our kids get older, when our grandkids get older, when our great-grandkids get older. We worry about what the country is going to look like, and corresponding to that, we worry about what the church is going to look like, and are we going to be able to make a difference in what's going to happen. It really all goes back to this thing that I mentioned a minute ago, and it has to do with power. What kind of power does the church have? What kind of power does Christianity have? What kind of power do Christians have to effect change, to make a difference, to share Christ, to influence public discussions about morality, to try to stem the tide of secularism? What kind of power do we have? I think those are important discussions to have. And we're going to go to Revelation 5, and I'm excited about this lesson. I'm excited about this text. It's one of the awesome texts of the Bible. There's so many of them. And I looked at your schedule for the next few months, and it looks awesome with the different topics you're discussing and the speakers you've got coming in. This one, when we talk about the Lion and the Lamb, has so much to say to us at this particular moment. I guess it's always going to be true. And it has something to say to us about power. And it has something to say to us about how God does what He does. And how God works through Christians. And how God uses the church. And what He does in societies and cultures. And how He engages political powers. And how He brings about His will. It has to do with power, which is a big deal. So our text is obviously in the book of Revelation. It's a off-discussed, off-misunderstood book, I guess. There's a lot of stuff in there we get confused about, but there's a lot we can understand. And this is one of those passages where you don't have to get, and throughout the book of Revelation this is true, you don't have to get every symbol right, but you can get the gist of these passages, and you can get what God wants you to get. And this is one of those that is pretty clear what I think is being taught, and I think it has something important to say to you and to me tonight. I want to go back through, Hunter read this a minute ago, and I want to read a little bit more than what I asked him to read. And I want you to think about where we are in the book of Revelation and what's going on in the culture at this time before we read these verses. Just remember, you read Revelation, read it like a first century person. Read it as a persecuted church. Read it as a church that has no political power, that has very little social, cultural capital to spend, They were persecuted. They were being killed. This, I believe, written by John, revealed to God to John in the last part of the first century. Things had changed from 30 years earlier, 40 years earlier. The emperors were starting to get more aggressive in their response to Christianity. Things were happening. Some of the stuff that we've read about, heard about, it was going on now. They're nervous. They're being killed. The empire is reigning supreme. Rome is at the pinnacle of its power. Rome has all power. Christians have no power, at least from a worldly, earthly kind of political perspective. They have no power. And so they're wringing their hands a lot, as you and I do sometimes, and as we would have done had we been them, They're wondering, they're concerned, what in the world? Is God really in control or not? What's going to happen to the church? What's going to happen to us? Are we going to be killed? Who's really got power here? So in the midst of all of that, John sees these visions. And in chapter 5, he sees, I saw, he says, in the right hand, the hand of power. So we're talking about power here. Just see these hints here. I saw in the right hand of him. This is throughout the Bible, the right hand is always associated with power, with strength. I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. That's God, right? A scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. There's a lack of power there. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, there's power. The root of David is conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who is seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. And I looked, and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. And I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that's in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. This is an incredible scene. John, by the way, he shares the concern of his people. And you see that throughout the book. You see it here with this crying. A couple of things. Let's talk about, let's kind of look at some of the words here, look at what's going on, make sure we understand that, and then we'll kind of extrapolate some reflections for us today. I mentioned to you the right hand of him who is seated on the throne, the strength, the hand of strength, the power of God. You got this scroll that's written within and on the back. In other words, it's written on both sides, which was a rarity. Usually with scrolls, they would write only on one side, but this one is written on both sides, probably just meant to denote or connote this idea of this is important. And I think what John envisions here, there's some debate about what this scroll is. Is it the book of life? When it says scroll, that just means a book, something that they would pass around and read. So it could have been the book of life, or it could have been, I think in context, probably it has something to do with John's wanting to know, what is God going to do? What does the future hold for the church? How is God going to accomplish His will in all this? It's written on front. It's written on back. It is sealed with 7 seals. When they would take a scroll, an important scroll that needed to be sealed in those days, they would, after they finished writing on it, they would roll it up, and they would wrap these threads around it. And if they really wanted to seal it, they would then take this wax and they would melt it over the threads that had been wrapped around the scroll. And on that wax, they would imprint, if it was an important document, if it was a legal document, for example, at the end of the writing on the scroll, they would write the names of the witnesses. And then they would wrap it up, put the thread on it, melt the wax, put the wax on the outside around the thread to seal it, and then each of the witnesses would take a signet ring and press it in the wax. And it was supposed to be only those witnesses who had the authority to open the scroll. So that's how things happen then. As far as the sealing with 7 seals, it's just meant to communicate this idea. This is really sealed. It's sealed tightly. It's not supposed to be opened by the wrong people or by the wrong person. So you get this powerful angel who stands and proclaims who is worthy to open the scroll. And it's interesting, he uses the word worthy here, kind of departing from the idea of power. He doesn't say who is strong enough or who is capable, but rather he says who is worthy, kind of changing the tone here just a little bit. But who is worthy to open the scroll? Because I think, he's hinting at something we're going to learn here in a minute, and it's not so much about what we think of as power as it is the nature of the one who's able to open it, the character, the who he is, not how, from an earthly perspective, how powerful he is. So who's worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? No one. Verse 3, no one was found. Kind of get the idea that they search. There's a pause here. And John is deeply, deeply saddened. Some translations translate verse 4, I began to weep and weep. It's a strong construction here in the original language. The ESV puts it, I began to weep loudly. But just understand this is an emphatic expression of sadness here. I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said, weep no more. Okay, so this is so cool what happens here. Because, John is stressed out. John is with his people. He shares the concern and worry of his people. He's crying. One of the elders says, don't cry anymore. This language is pretty familiar to most of us in here. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And that goes back, by the way, to Genesis 49. Do you remember at the end of Jacob's life when he was pronouncing a blessing on all of the 12 sons? And he went through each one of them. And in Genesis 49, when he's pronouncing the blessings on Judah, he uses the lion's language, the lion's cub language. And he goes on and he connects the idea of lion with scepter. And so you've got in that blessing that Jacob gives to Judah, this imagery of lion, which represents throughout Scripture and even today in our own thinking, if we use it in some sort of symbolic way. We would use the word lion as Judah did, and that it means power, right? And so he combines it in his pronouncement of blessing on Judah, the lion idea with a scepter in the tribe of Judah. In other words, there's going to be power, and there's going to be reigning, and there's going to be strength. And so through Judah's lineage, we read this, thousands of years later, and we see what happens, and we know exactly what Judah meant now. But of course, he's looking ahead to this thing that's going to happen, that God's going to do, that through the tribe of Judah. Judah's going to become the most powerful tribe, of Israel. Through Judah, of course, Saul, the first king, came from Benjamin. But after that, David came from the tribe of Judah. And then that lineage keeps going ahead, with Solomon and Rehoboam and on, right? These kings, that was important, this lineage. So you've got the lion, the strength, the scepter. The one who's reigning is going to come from Judah. The next phrase there, the root of David, is taken from Isaiah 11, probably. It says the root of Jesse there. And this is almost certainly leaning on that passage in Isaiah 11, the root of David, the branch of David, the root of Jesse. And again, it's a reference to this lineage, this Davidic lineage. It was very important. You looked at this before. If you open the first page of the Gospel of Matthew, the first page of the New Testament, you read what Matthew does there at the very beginning, and he traces the lineage of Jesus. Abraham, son of Abraham, the son of David, and then he goes back and he goes from Abraham all the way through that lineage of David and extending to Joseph, Mary, to Jesus, showing that Jesus is qualified. He's Jewish. He's a descendant of David. He has the right to be the king. All that. So when it says this, what we're hearing here is what we expect to hear. I think it's what John expects to hear. I wish we hadn't already read the rest of it. I wish we didn't have the lion and the lamb here in front of us, because you know where this is going. But if we could pretend for a minute that we only have the first 5 verses, then we would be intrigued here, and we kind of would be expecting this. Who's worthy? Who's going to be able to open the seals? Who can do it? Well, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Of course, he can do it. The descendant of David, the great king. And that tribe of Judah, the root of David, and Jewish thinking, of course, it was a reference to this king, this Davidic Messiah who would come. Even in the Old Testament, the Jews in the time of Christ, they were anticipating the Davidic Messiah. Now understand where we are. Nobody can open this thing. And then the elder says, but the lion can open it. The lion with the right lineage, the lion, the king, the scepter-wielding king that descended from David, he can open the seal. And in this interesting juxtaposition of verse 6 to verse 5. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders I saw. Not a lion here. I saw a lamb. There are a couple of things that are interesting. One commentary I was looking at pointed out this juxtaposition idea. If you go back to verse 4, you're going to see this worship and praise, and you see it at the last part of this, the singing of a new song in verse 9. And in the midst of the singing, in the midst of this praise and all this worship, you've got John crying. And so you've got the worship and the praise kind of in juxtaposition of that, you've got the weeping and crying of John. And now you've got this great figure of a lion and the strength and kings and scepters and Judah, the strongest tribe and all that. You've got that. And now you've got what? If you had to contrast this in the animal world, strength and weakness, you couldn't do any better than the way God does it for us here. The strength of the lion in contrast to the weakness of a lamb. And so between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain. 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. A lamb, not just a lamb, but a lamb that's been killed. A lamb alive is weak. A lamb that's been killed is the epitome of weakness. And yet the lamb is standing. And the lamb has 7 horns and 7 eyes. There's so much going on here, I think that's pretty important. But you got the lamb standing, and though it's been killed, and We read this as Christians and we know what this is getting at. We know the background of Isaiah 52 and 53, this lamb that was led this one who was led as a sheep to the slaughter, right? We know that language of the Passover lamb, and we know what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5 about the Paschal lamb being Christ. And so we're very familiar with Jesus being referred to as a lamb. And so there's no great stretch to see, of course, who he's talking about here. And then we see a nod to the resurrection. So you've got the lamb that has been slain, and yet it is standing. Jesus, the lamb who was slain on that Friday, and yet he was standing on Sunday. So you've got death and resurrection. And you've got it in the context set over against this backdrop of strength in verse 5. You've got this picture of weakness, a lamb standing, having been killed, and yet now it's standing. But then it's got this 7 horns. The background of that may very well be Daniel 7. There's this, if you go back and study Daniel 7, there's this vision that Daniel has of these various animals that come. The 4th one represents, if you look at it, I think it's pretty clear he's referring to these kingdoms that would arise, from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece and then to Rome. And Rome has these horns. This animal has these horns on it. These horns, in apocalyptic context, refer to political power and strength. A lot of people think that with this image, this lamb, dead lamb that's now living with 7 horns, that's a parody of the horns that were on the animal in Daniel 7 that represented Rome. In Daniel's vision, that now you've got this lamb that has the horns on it. The horns representing political power. It's kind of like a parody of, you think Rome has political power. Let me show you what power looks like. It fits with the context. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the 7 eyes representing the 7 spirits of God. So you've got in this context, maybe that has something to do with omniscience, this perfect awareness. But in this passage, you've got God the Father on the throne. You've got God the Son who is also in the center, which is supposed to connote, equality. He's God as well. And then you've got the 7 spirits here. So you've got the Trinity. You've got this Trinitarian kind of teaching here. And he took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. He took the scroll. Everybody bows down. You've got the worshiping. We're not going to study the last part of this chapter, but in essence what happens is after he takes the scroll, you've got this awareness and this worship of the Lamb and worship of God, worship of the Spirit, this idea of everything is going to be okay because God is present. Now, I want to spend the last part of our time with you thinking about what that means to us. Let's reflect on this as Christians now. The main point of this, I think there's one main point here, and it is the point that God's power is manifested in weakness. And that's no surprise to a Wednesday night crowd. You know the teaching of Scripture. You know that this is a principle that's embedded in so many narratives in the Bible. But it just comes through so visually and so beautifully here. And it goes back to the cross. And you think about what he's trying to teach us here, going back to where we were just a few minutes ago about power and weakness. And I sense this. I feel it sometimes myself. I sense it when I talk to Christians, especially over the past few years with political turmoil and changing ideology and changing views on things that are core to our identity, like gender and sexuality, and so many things that are going on culturally, and we see this like the floodgates being open toward secularism and fewer people believe in God and fewer people are going to church, and COVID and the influence it's had, that the damage or whatever's happened on cultural institutions, including the church, and waning attendance. I mean, you know the stuff, right? We're all, what's going on? We feel powerless at times. What can we do? What can we do to stem the tide? How do we make a difference? What can we do to help our country turn back to God? And sometimes I think we go at it in a way that's not the way we should. Sometimes we think, and I don't know, I can't speak for you, but I think that sometimes in the church we get caught up in thinking about power in the wrong way. And we think that, for example, with things like political power, sometimes there's a little bit too much hand-wringing among Christians because of what's happening with elections. Like sometimes there's a little bit too much celebration going on when we get the person we think ought to be in there, and there's a little bit too much of weeping and gnashing of teeth when the wrong person gets in there, right? And there's this feeling, it seems, that we're losing because we're not in those positions of power anymore, if we ever were. I mean, you kind of look at how this happens historically. And typically, and you may have a different view on this, which is fine, but I just want you to think about it a little bit. Historically speaking, nations don't do well. Well, I should say Christianity doesn't do well when Christianity and political structures are too closely intertwined. I think about what's going on in Europe now, and you know that Europe is ahead of us in its trip down this lane of secularism, right? And you go back in England, so you go back in Western Europe's history, and the mixing, even to this day, at least in a superficial way, of say, for example, of the political power and the power of the Church of England, for example, and how all that stuff happens. You go back and you look at how, the institutional church, what's happened along with that in Western Europe is so many people have turned away from expressions of faith in any way. In part, at least, because when Christianity gets in bed with politics, with this political power, it produces this thing that's ugly. And I think you can make an argument that sometimes in America we've done the same thing at times with our kind of craving for political power. And you can go back to, I don't know, you can go back forever on this, but certainly in the last 50 years, in the 70s in the 80s with the moral majority and some of the kind of the political movements where we need to get our people in power. And by the way, I'm not suggesting we don't vote consistently with our Christian belief. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm only wanting you to think about this, that sometimes we Christians can think that the church is in trouble because we're not getting the people we want in the seats of power. And I think what the message of the Bible is, and what the message of our text tonight is that God does His greatest work from a position of weakness, apparent weakness. That isn't that what the cross always meant, what it always represented. That's why it was such a stumbling. 1 Corinthians 1, Paul talks about it there. He's like, this is a stumbling block. I mean, you and I, again, a Wednesday night crowd, I know we think about the cross in a different way, but one of the difficulties it had in the first century was, how in the world how is it even fathomable that God was on a cross? God is strong, and the cross is, there was nothing weaker than the cross, than a position being on the cross. Nothing. Absolutely helpless. Jesus hanging on the cross, that was an image of helplessness and weakness. That was it. Stretched out, naked, hanging on a cross for all the world to see. Shame. Rome was in control. And Jesus, whom you believe to be, what? God? Are you kidding me? God's on a cross. That, and yet Paul says that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talking about the thorn in the flesh, he had something. God gave him a thorn in the flesh. He prayed repeatedly that God would take it away, and God did not. And in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9, this is what the Lord said to Paul. after he's telling him, no, I'm not going to take it away, Paul. Paul says, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. It's just interesting how the Lord is speaking to him in a position of weakness. Paul's like, I don't want this. It's limiting me. I can't do ministry like I want, whatever it was doing. I don't know. We don't know what it was, of course. But he wanted to be rid of it. It's just, at best, it was a distraction to him. At worst, it was inhibiting his ability to do ministry. Lord, take it away. And God said, no, I will not take it away because my power is made perfect in weakness, which is exactly what we learn at the cross. That the power of God is not in the lion. The power of God is in the Lamb. And I'd suggest for us, Christians, to think seriously about our own response to the travails in the world and the trajectories that we see around us, not by hand-wringing over losing these political positions of power, but rather to get caught up in recognizing that God changes the world through Jesus. And He changes the world through people coming face to face with a crucified and resurrected Messiah. And so often, we're just, so often I find myself thinking and getting discouraged because I see the church losing its influence or whatever. And maybe get a little bit of feel a little bit of excitement when you see, man, this elected official or this Supreme Court nominee or this or that or whatever, and think, oh, good. There's nothing wrong with reflecting in a Christian way. I was thinking about this earlier today because I got this email about an upcoming movie, and I get emails from PureFlix, which I think we subscribed to in the past, produce wholesome movies or whatever. And but I got this email, and it was about an upcoming movie that Mark Wahlberg produced. And so he actually paid for it out of his pocket. It's called Father Stew. I don't know if you saw. I went and watched the trailer. And it was interesting because, Mark Wahlberg, I think his background is in Catholicism. I may be wrong on that, but I think he's Catholic. And so the trailer it's about somebody who, I think he's living a pretty rough life, has some sort of conversion experience, and becomes a priest, something like that. It's a faith-based kind of movie. Mel Gibson's in it. Of course, you know about his Catholicism as well. And anyway, but when I see, I like seeing Mark Wahlberg, he has. We disagree about a lot of things, of course, Christian-wise, but at least he claims faith in Christ in some sense. We've got somebody out there who has some Christian faith. Isn't that great? Whoever it is, and I saw that, I was like, man, I like to see that. I like Mark Wahlberg a little bit better than I did a couple hours ago, because we got this similarity, and he believes in Jesus, right? And that's great. But we get excited about political power, and we get excited when we see somebody like that. No, we've got a little bit more cultural power, We've got a little bit more social power. So what? That's not how God changes people's hearts. He doesn't change it through political appointees. He doesn't change it through movie stars who happen to share a faith. We may get excited about some big-name athlete who claims Christ as his Lord and Savior, but that's not how God changes hearts. It's not through the lion. It's not through the power. It's not through the position of influence. It's through the Lamb who was slain and yet standing. Jesus said, I think he used this expression in two different ways. He said, when the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. A reference initially to the crucifixion of Jesus, right? When he's lifted up from the earth in crucifixion, but also he uses it with sort of a dual meaning, I think. And it has to do with the subsequent resurrection and exaltation to the right hand of God, that he is lifted up from the earth in crucifixion. He is lifted up from the earth in resurrection and exaltation. You see, no matter what happens in our country, and you'd be hard-pressed to make any kind of an argument that we're approaching anything remotely similar to what these Christians were facing in Revelation 5. And yet, God says to them, his initial response to John's discouragement is a dead lamb who's living. A lamb who had been slain that is standing with 7 horns that represented political power. Where's God's power to be found? It's in the cross. It's in Jesus. It is in the message of one who had, we sing it, who could have called 10,000 angels. And yet he chose to become weak so that through that act of self-sacrifice, he would show us the power that God wields through weakness. And so to the church, I think it says something to us. Let's not get overly discouraged about losing the seat at the table, the political table, the cultural, social, institutional table. Let's not get overly discouraged about that. Let's not get terribly excited when we get a little bit of a louder voice at the cultural, institutional, political, social table, because that's not where change really, really happens. God will always give us a voice, but that voice goes along with the voice of Jesus. That's the voice that we have. And to the extent that we as Christians, from our position of weakness, God will do great things. And I think this ought to encourage us as Christians. This story ought to encourage us, because there's nothing in chapter 5 here that's changed. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, he's conquered. He can still open the scroll and its 7 seals. And he does it as a lamb that had been slain and is now standing. See, that is as true today as it ever was. And so when we find ourselves thinking that we are powerless to make a difference, let's remember that God still uses us people. It doesn't matter where we are culturally or politically. If you can use your life and your voice to share a message about a crucified Messiah who was resurrected on the 3rd day, that's where true power is to be found. You may feel like your voice doesn't matter, that you're too insignificant, you're too ineloquent, that you don't have as many opportunities, you don't have the money, you don't have the capital, you don't have the influence, you don't have the power. But isn't it amazing? God has always chosen the weak. God's always chosen the weak to do the most powerful things. If you're not a Christian tonight, you know, we've been talking about the resurrected Messiah, and this is what conversion looks like. Conversion, really at its essence, is saying that I thought I could do this myself. You know, I thought I could do life myself. I thought I could become my own God and do it my own way. But conversion is recognizing that you're giving up your power and you're becoming weak and you are submitting to Him. That's the epitome of baptism. It is a passive act where you give up power and you are buried and you are resurrected. You're going back to the cross and you are confessing in that very moment that the weakness of Christ has become your strength. And that's where God chooses to save us, in that act of weakness. It's all over the pages of the Bible. So maybe tonight you need to come and you need to give your heart and life to Jesus, to be baptized into Him, to say to Him, I give up my power and I submit my everything that I am to You. Or maybe you need to ask for the prayers of God's people at this church because your life is strayed away and you've, tried to take the reins of control in your life back, and whatever happened, it doesn't go well for us when we do that. Maybe you need to come home tonight and ask for prayers. Let's stand and sing. If you need to come, I hope you'll do that now.